Hello, thanks for joining us to discuss challenges facing the food and beverage manufacturers and how IFS ERP can help overcome those challenges. My name is Jay Gentle. I'm the Channel Sales Director at Enterprise Consulting, and joining me is Bob Corrigan. Bob is VP of Established Accounts for IFS and has decades of experience helping IFS customers achieve business results. Combined, Bob and I have over 50 years experience in the manufacturing ERP industry. I have a few short slides to provide some insight to IFS and Enterprise Consulting, and then we're going to explore challenges facing the food and beverage manufacturers, how IFS can help overcome those challenges, and then review some current trends in the food and beverage industry. First, I want to provide an introduction to IFS. It's an established global ERP software company with a market-leading product. They've been experiencing industry-leading growth in the market due to their solutions and approach. IFS has been in business almost 40 years with a large global reach, which means they bring a deep and robust solution to your business. IFS has a very robust partner network program that certifies and recognizes its partner levels based upon the number of successful IFS implementations and the number of IFS certified consultants a partner has. Platinum is the highest level a partner can achieve. Enterprise Consulting is the first IFS Platinum partner in North America and the only one with headquarters in the U.S. today. We've been servicing IFS customers for 20 years. It can be a source to help you evaluate if IFS is a fit for your business. So Bob, why don't you talk a little bit about the food and beverage manufacturing industry as we see it today?
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Jay. Well, obviously, food and beverage is one of the more complex industries that exist, primarily because of the diversity of products and the different processes and system requirements needed to support those. So if you look at some examples, fresh produce or fruit or dairy, those types of products, you can't really buffer your demand with stock because the products will spoil. So this is really very much a make the forecast, you plan the forecast, and then you actually readjust your planning daily based on what orders you actually get. And then, of course, you can have some products you can freeze them. So, even though you're making, fresh vegetables, you may also do frozen or fresh meats. You can freeze meats. And once they're frozen, then you can build stock and you can have more of a make the stock type of environment. And then, of course, you go way to the far extreme of, some alcoholic beverages. They're actually making product today that they have to forecast that they're going to sell in maybe 6 years, 7 years, when you get into some of the scotches and bourbons and things that are in the marketplace. So they require very much of a multi-year demand plan. And, IFS really accommodates this best because we support, mixed mode manufacturing capabilities and would allow companies to do both fresh fruits and jams, fresh and frozen meats, fresh and frozen pies, and et cetera, things like that. So, we really can support that entire breadth of the food and beverage manufacturing.
That's great. Thanks for that insight into the industry, Bob. So can you tell us what you're hearing about from your customers and the challenges that they're facing in food and beverage manufacturers?
Well, we're seeing a fair amount of, new product innovation requirements, and this is really, the people in this particular industry have a requirement to get shelf space. And, to get shelf space, you have to adjust to the actual retailer that's selling it, whether it's in a grocery or specialty store. And you really have to be responsive to what the customers are demanding. So, having the ability to do fast new product innovations and get those out to market is, one of the key challenges we see food and beverage facing, especially. And then you move over to demand planning and fulfillment. The most of food and beverage has, very diverse life and planning cycles because you have seasonality, you have the consumer's behavior, you have weather impact, you have even things like social media impact. When somebody says something about, they received a spoiled product or a contaminated product and, how that can get out and affect things. So, and in addition to that, all the materials that are typically used in food and beverage, as a material that's grown or, taken from an animal, it has regional requirements. It has seasonality to it. There are only certain times of the year that you can harvest certain, vegetables, potatoes, all those types of things. And then depending on where you're getting your product in the world, that can be affected now by climate change, trade barriers that keep getting thrown up, political disruptions in some of the countries. If you're dealing with products like bananas or you're dealing with, those types of things, they can be disrupted pretty easily and that affects your product. So having a real robust demand planning and fulfillment system really helps with that. Clean labeling, that's kind of a thing that's coming, really because consumers are demanding to know what the provenance of the products are. And then, of course, the retailers are trying to ensure that they can provide that to their consumers. So there's a lot of data transparency to support those trends. And that's part of this clean labeling requirement. So someone can pick up a product, they may scan a QR code and it'll tell them whether or not there's any food additives that have been used, whether there's colorations that are in it, and that will help to, maintain the labeling requirements that are out there. And then some of the sustainability schemes that you're seeing, like in the US right now, the labeling of product with country of origin requirements. So that's all part of this clean labeling initiative that's across the food and beverage industry particularly. And then, consumer behavior, in food and beverage, there's a lot of change in consumer, demand, what form of protein are they going to consume, moving away from red meats and, looking for organic, sustainable ingredients in the products that they're consuming. This is getting more and more focus. And then some startup companies, don't have the legacy of some of the longer term organizations, and they can be much more nimble in, getting into something that's considered completely organic or something like that. And in the circular economy, that's kind of another new buzzword that's out there. This is, for, companies like that make food products and beverage products, where are your ingredients being sourced? Is that source sustainable? Are the growers that you're getting your materials from, in like a free trade agreement, all the different types of organizations that are out there to make sure that you're buying product that is grown in a sustainable, organic fashion. And it also, the whole circular economy, we'll talk about it a little bit later, drives a lot of efficiencies in your plant. How do you automate and capture information? How do you reduce the amount of waste that you have in your product and, ensure that it's, can go into a landfill safely or be recycled safely? So that's kind of the word they use to describe that. And then sustainability, is part of that whole circular economy. And again, it comes down to a lot of transparency and tracking. If you look at one, there's the sustainability of palm oil. That's a certification that requires manufacturers to demonstrate that they're using sustainable palm oil in their products. And that requires understanding what the balance is between their sustainable and non-sustainable oil usages monthly, and then be able to report that to maintain their certification. So a lot of things that affect food and beverage manufacturing.
Yeah, there certainly are. Great. Thanks, Bob. And I know that, IFS has some great ways of helping companies, overcoming those challenges. And we can talk about some of those.
Yeah, IFS has been in food and beverage for, 20 plus years. And, our product is not really just the discrete manufacturing product. So we have, formulations, and we have full recipe managements, not just the traditional bills of materials. When it comes to sales forecasting and seasonality, that is all fully integrated within IFS. And, we support even things like demand-driven MRP, which is, fairly unique in the industry. Sales promotions, campaigns, and rebates. Again, this is fully integrated within our system. And, customers, particularly in food and beverage, use it to meet all their trade promotion requirements. And in quality control and analysis, again, this is fully integrated within IFS. It's not, extra products. And, it includes control plans, statistical process, control charting, nonconformance reporting, supplier quality audits. All of that is, fully integrated in the solution. And then a critical part to food and beverage is traceability, shelf life, expiration date management, to do that both for your purchase materials or ingredients as well as your manufactured products or end products. And then lot traceability within IFS, can be utilized for handling any kind of product notices that you have to make, or in the event that you have to do a recall to be able to know which lots you would have to recall and make those notices. So that's another unique thing that IFS has fully integrated in our solution. The supplier batch, balance, is again, uses an automated master schedule. This helps to determine what your batch sizes should be the frequency of running those particular batches to meet your demand requirements. So, and again, based on what your supply may be, maybe you're waiting for a specific type of a meat product and you're not able to get it today. So you have to adjust your batch size based on what you have in stock. So those are the types of things that IFS does and supports automatically. Multiple units of measure. Again, this is something that's somewhat unique to the food and beverage sector. IFS has full support for catch weight as well as co-product and byproduct. So we can support things like, red meat grading, whether or not that's going to be, prime or whether it's going to be choice. And then being able to do catch weights where you're, doing pieces when you're selling it by pounds, all those types of things are fully supported. And then here it says dangerous goods information. This is really tracking what's called hazardous criterias. Those would be things like, is this an allergenic ingredient, a carcinogenic ingredient, a mutagenic ingredient, and really helps for you to ensure that your products are, isolated so that you're not doing nut allergy, transfers or dairy allergy transfers, all those things that, food and beverage have to always worry about related to allergens. And then, of course, always waiting now to whether it's genetically modified materials. So you can track all of those things in IFS using material criteria tracking. And then sequencing and characteristics, this is, again, something that's fully integrated in IFS. It really helps for manufacturers that are, doing batches and you have to do equipment cleaning between, setups, between batches, and helps to determine what's the best sequence to optimize, the frequency that you have to clean your equipment and the frequency that you have to do new setups to support, different batches that you're loading. So those are things that are, fully integrated directly into the IFS system.
Wow, that's a lot. Thank you for giving some insight, because I know IFS does a very good job in handling companies in this industry. So we're starting to see some trends in this food and beverage manufacturing industry, and there's some interesting stories of how IFS customers have adjusted to those trends. Can you tell us about a couple of them?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, clean labeling or e-labeling, is becoming more and more of not just a nice to have, but kind of a required to have to make sure that, when you're in the retailer and the consumer is looking at your product, that they really can feel, good about utilizing products and that you can stand behind those and prove it. So a lot of that is, it mentions here about, authenticity and transparency and, some of the impacts on your product, really ensuring compliance for what you have to do with your product, ensuring your end customer satisfaction, whether that's the retailer or the end consumer, and then reducing all the risks that might happen, if you don't label your product correctly and it has an allergen in it and, someone gets sick from it, that's always very bad for your reputation. And as an example here, I said, Nature's Path is one of our customers. They're the first cereal company in North America that's been able to achieve a zero weight certification for all three of their manufacturing facilities. And you'll see that, on a lot of their labeling. So that's kind of one of the trends that you see in the food and beverage sector.
Yeah, they're a great story for that. Definitely, they've mission focused around zero waste. How about this company, Whitworth?
Yeah, well, digital technology, I mean, this is another area where, being able to use, quote unquote technology to make you be able to react quicker, to have, all kinds of, information at your fingertips to help you make good decisions. Again, to drive satisfaction that you're producing your product and getting it to the consumer on time. And then being able to just manage your equipment and making sure that it's operating at its most efficient status by monitoring the equipment and maintaining that equipment and doing your preventive maintenance. So we have one of our Whitworths, they do packed nuts and dried fruits. And they use machine learning and they'll do a lot of forecasting based on weather patterns, historical sales, seasonality, and they've helped contribute to our product to really tune in how you can do interday planting or intraday planning, which is a function that IFS supports that a lot of our competitors do not.
Wow, another nice story. Thanks. So you mentioned earlier sustainability and the circular economy. I mean, the sustainability is certainly becoming more top of mind for consumers, which means it needs to be more top of mind for the manufacturers as well. Can you explain a little bit more on that? And maybe we got another story on them, I think.
Yeah. Again, this is all about, where are your raw materials and components coming from? Are they traceable? Are they, can they be proven to be organic? Can they be proven to be, non-genetic material or containing, and then how that drives what you have for your product switch outs and how fast you can do that. Can you manufacture and produce those products in your plants with your current equipment, your current packaging? How does that affect distribution? More and more, we're seeing distribution where, it used to be consumers came to a store and bought your product. Now they're staying at home and somebody's delivering it. So now there's an extra step in that distribution channel that didn't used to have to be there. How the consumers can look up information about your products, your company, or, anything that goes wrong can, be pretty instantly available where that didn't used to be true. And then one of the things is, making sure you're maintaining the equipment and all the things that you have to do there and minimize the waste and maximize the ability to recycle and reuse. So that's kind of what they call the circular economy and potentially how it would handle there.
Great. And I think there's a nice story on that. And one of our customers is achieving that.
Yeah. And again, this is, on manufacturing automation, customer service, managing your resources effectively. VitaCrest is another customer that makes fresh produce is their primary product and herbs. And, they grow those. They moved away from the traditional plastic, black pots, as many of them, to a gray one that is biodegrade. And this allowed them to really make, a big deal about their ability to have that full recycle functions within their products. And, it's a storyline that they use for the consumers and for their distribution channel.
Great. So, Bob, I know you mentioned earlier that, IFS has been supporting the food and beverage manufacturing industry for a number of years. I mean, there's some great names to talk about, maybe just a couple of quick stories and some of the other customers they might share.
Sure. So, we've got, like the standard process, they do a lot of herbal products, direct farm to consumer. So they grow their own herbal products and then they, package them and sell them and distribute them. Diamond Pet is a large name. They do a lot of private brand, manufacturing of products for pets, cats, dogs, even, when you move into, larger animals in zoos and things like that. Gaia Herbs, again, is another supplement company. They have their own farms, fully sustainable, and package and sell their materials. Well Pet is another one that does different types of products for pets, primarily cats and dogs. Grecian Delight, is a manufacturer of many Greek types of products, all the way from meat products to yogurts. And then, Bronco Wine is a producer of, wines, reds, whites throughout. They're California based, but they distribute across all of North America. They bottle probably a couple of hundred brands. So just a couple, and we have lots more diversity across the entire product line.
Yeah, and this time kind of crosses some of those sectors we talked about earlier on the previous slides. Well, thanks for your insight, Bob. It was very helpful to understand what's going on in the industry and how IFS is helping support them. And thank you all for your time today.